Okay, so today we're going to be working on a 2007 Buick Lucerne. Currently we're going to be working on the cam and crank sensors for the vehicle. We're going to be setting some faults along with putting it on a picoscope and testing voltages and resistance on 2 of the sensors. Okay, so right here we have our hand-drawn schematic. Right here we have our ICM ignition control module. Up here's our cam sensor, right here's our crank sensor. Both sensors are Hall effect sensors. Coming out of the ICM, there's 3 wires, our 12 volts, our low reference wire, and our signal wire. Both these wires go straight into our cam sensor. Right here, 12 reference and signal. We have a switch right here that's giving the signal. Then our reference wire and 12-volt wire are both spliced off to go to our crank sensor. Over here we have the splice going to the 12 volt and then our reference wire going to this. Down here, our crank sensor, we do have 2 signals, meaning we have 4 wires. Most crank sensors usually have 4 wires. We ended up having 4 wires. We found out that one of the wires is dormant. It does not do much, but the signal wire 1 does take all the information and send it back to the ICM. Then again, signal 1 goes to here and signal 2 goes to here. For the locations of our crankshaft sensor and our camshaft sensor, it's a little hard to see, but right below this crankshaft pulley is going to be the location of our crankshaft sensor, and just above it is going to be our camshaft sensor. To get a better look at things, we pulled up the diagram on ALLDATA. This is going to be the crankshaft pulley. This is our crankshaft sensor, and just above the crankshaft pulley is the camshaft sensor.
All right, so on this vehicle, we have 5 total wires for our 2 sensors. Our first wire is this white with black wire, which is we have hooked into a white pin here, which is our 12-volt reference for both sensors. Our next wire is a black with white wire, which we have hooked into this black pin here, which is our common ground for both sensors. Then we have our brown with white, which is our wire for our cam signal wire. And last we have our blue with white and our solid yellow wire, which are these blue and yellow pins, which are our signal wires for our crankshaft.
Alright, so currently we are still on the 2007 Buick Lucerne. We have all of our back pins into all of these sensors. Currently our crankshaft and camshaft sensors are still plugged in. Right now we have our voltmeter hooked up to the crankshaft sensor. With key on, engine off, we are reading about 6.53 to 6.55 volts consistently. We also do have the picoscope hooked up right now. At this line, you can also see that we are at a consistent 6.34-ish volts. Okay, so we now have switched where our voltmeter is hooked up. We now have it on the camshaft sensor. Currently on our voltmeter, we are reading 6.52 volts with key on, engine off. It is also staying consistent. Just like the crankshaft sensor, we also have it hooked up to a picoscope, and as of right now, that is also consistently reading 6.53 volts with key on, engine off. Currently, we now still have it on our camshaft sensor. Right now, it's key on, engine on. On our voltmeter, we are currently reading a voltage drop of approximately 1 volt. It's fluctuating between, it goes as low as 5.6 volts up to 6.4 volts. It is jumping around. We also have it hooked up to our picoscope currently. Ignore the green wire for right now. The red line is our camshaft. It is currently dropping down to 0 volts and going up to around 7 volts. Each time it is dropping, it is reading a cylinder.
So we currently have our voltmeter hooked up to our crankshaft sensor, and it is reading roughly around 5.5 volts. And if we go over to our picoscope, you can see on our picoscope that the graph is showing every time that the scope senses cylinder 1 coming around into position. So looking into our graph here on our picoscope a little bit more, I'm going to start with our scaling, which we are going to have our cam sensor at 20 volt scale and our crank sensor at a 10 volt scale. So when we look at our graph, you can see that our crank voltage seems to be double what our cam voltage is. But even though it looks this way, they are both reading about 6.5 volts. For our cam sensor, you can see that it is at high voltage most of the time, with a dip every 6 readings for our cam sensor. This is because the reading that we get from our crank sensor is reading only cylinder 1, while our cam sensor is reading each cylinder individually, with the spikes being the sensing point for each cylinder. So we currently have our crankshaft position sensor unplugged. We're going to go ahead and crank the car and see if it starts. All right, so as we can see, the car is not going to start. We are assuming this is because the crankshaft position sensor only senses cylinder 1. So we're assuming that the engine uses the crankshaft position sensor in order to tell it when to fire spark and fuel in order to start the car.
After further examination, we have now hooked up a OBD2 scanner to the vehicle, and we have now been able to prove that after running the DTCs with the crankshaft sensor unplugged, we did not get any codes due to cranking with no sensor in.
All right, so we currently have the cam position sensor unhooked, and we're going to go ahead and crank the car and see what it does. All right, so as we can see, it started up and it did not start much different than when the position sensor is hooked up to the car. We can also come over and look at our picoscope, and we can see that the cam sensor is not reading, but the crank sensor is giving us a normal reading. Alright, so currently we have everything hooked up correctly with both the sensors plugged back in. We're going to go ahead and jump the signal for the cam position sensor to ground and see what happens. So we can see that nothing happens with the ground wire. We're going to go ahead and then jump the cam sensor to power. And as we can see, the car dies.
Now moving on to the crankshaft sensor. We now have the car back and running and both sensors still in. First, what I'm going to do, since our sensor does have signal 1 and signal 2, I'm going to jump signal 1 to ground. Jumping signal 1 to ground does kill the car. The car did die, so we restarted the car. Now I'm going to do signal 1 to power. That also killed the vehicle. Now going over to signal 2, I'm going to be jumping signal 2 to ground for the crankshaft sensor. That made it die. Okay, for our last fault, we're going to be jumping the crankshaft signal 2 wire to power. After seeing what just happened, I do believe that the car has also died due to signal 2 jumping straight to power.
After doing tests on signal 2, we did figure out that the car does not like to start after the signal 2 was jumped to power or ground. We're going to give a demonstration of what it does after we have done some of the faults. After all of our tests and faults, it turns out we do not have any DTCs, along with we do not have any pending codes.